Asinivusele Maswati lamahle sinivusele benkosilenhle ehlelweni Embili kanye libito lami ngingijola kwinfokodo Maswati akithi ukuthi besingaphindze sidibane eminyakeni lomusha umnyaka wanga 2022 angithathe ke lithuba bekunene kunifisela ke umnyaka lomuhle umnyaka wempumelelo kuwo kumnyaka wanga 2022. I know a lot of people have set their goals for the new year, in particular looking back into what has happened in the year 2020, 2021, COVID-19 and so many other issues that have affected us as a nation, and not just us as a nation, but globally, we've been battered by so many things, you know, in particular the advent of COVID-19. And ngiyafisa Maswati akithi ukuthi engazuthi lo mnyaka lona bekungaba ngumnyaka lapho khona masithi sifisa kuphumelela kube tinto vele lesitita uphumelela. I remember how in 2020 in particular the year was dubbed the year of 20 but that didn't happen obviously because of COVID-19, and 2021 came and we saw the second wave, the third wave of COVID-19, and now we are being told of the fourth wave. You know, should we anticipate a heavy fifth wave of COVID-19? Those are not issues we do want to experience, especially because it has stalled most of our dreams, our goals, and certain agendas that we've set for ourselves as individuals and as nations. Kungako ke sithi sicela ke lo mdala wethu insuku ngethemba nje ukuthi awunaloko kubuya ke masonto namuhla sithandazile sathandazela leyo ndzaba ukuthi asithi siphumelela as individuals naleli live lakithi libe ke liphumelela, but we are not going to prosper as Eswatini in isolation. We are going to prosper if our neighbors prosper. We are going to prosper if our regional members prosper, your SADC, and even us as a continent prosper. So kuthandazela ukuthi uphumelele wena wetfana ngeke uze kukuside, because you are going to derive your strength and your opportunity from the person next to you, and that's how you are going to connect and then become a collective success as a continent, which is why I think even today our topic has to do with what are we doing as Africans to prosper. And there are interesting developments that are happening, yes, in Eswatini, but we do have brilliant minds that are coming up with brilliant concepts that are going to help us to achieve a collective success as a continent. Ngithi ke Maswati lamahle nanamuhla kunimema nje ehlelweni ukuthi ke nibe ingcenye yale discussion yale nkulumo lesitawuba nayo ikhulumisa ukuthi singaba ngcono njani singemaswati, singaba ngcono njani ngekuthi ke sibe ingcenye ekuphumelelisa ke liphupho le region iSADC, liphupho leAfrica kwekuthi sikhone ke kuthengiselana, sikhone ke ukuthi imikhicito lesilanza ngaphandle siyilanzelana ngekhathi ke eAfrica. I know ukuthi esikhathini lesinyenti kibe ngazothi sikhuluma ngebantu ke lababonsondozima labanetimali, but we are not talking about that. We are talking about your particular involvement in making Africa the success that it has to be, in terms of how do you participate economically to make sure that we achieve these goals as the African region. Siyabonga kakhulu nje benkosilenhle ukuthi nibe nathi la, and as part of this discussion today I do want to assure you that there are some interesting things we will be discussing letihambelana nekuthi how can you come out better equipped, better empowered at the end of this discussion, in particular because of issues of COVID-19, which is why I was saying it's shy kakhulu, but what can we do to sort of like be more resilient? You know, we saw so many African countries in the European Union, in America, there were economic stimulus that were offered by governments there. Can we expect something of that nature in this discussion? Do stay with us to find out if you have an opportunity to experience what people in the first world countries experience in terms of economic stimulus, which they got just because of the advent of COVID-19. With me in the studio, ladies and gentlemen, is an esteemed guest of mine by the name of His Right Honorable Timothy McPherson, who is the chairperson of Africa's sixth economic bloc, which is called ECO6. And alongside her is Doris, who is also the protocol officer in the organization. I am not going to introduce this organization myself, but I'm going to give the opportunity to the chairperson of this most esteemed regional bloc just to tell us more about it and what it is about, what it means for the people of Eswatini, the people of the region of SADC and Africa at large. Your Excellency, if I may say, a good afternoon and a good evening, and welcome to the show.
A wonderful good afternoon to you, and thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course. You are a president, you are a chairman, but you are also a chief, which is why I said to you, His Right Honorable. Am I right to say that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Doris, angikubingelele tata wethu nguphela ithuba lekuvusela eMaswati.
Ngibingelele mfundisi kaMgwane. Ngiyajabula futhi balahlelwe namuhla.
Sibonge kakhulu. I think I've said a lot about the prosperity of Africa, you know, what we need to do as Africans, as individuals, you know. But I think in particular, we are here today because of the sixth region of Africa, which we call ECO6, you know, which I think is another economic bloc that has come out from the African diaspora. You may want to explain a little bit more what this organization is about.
Well, indeed, you know, celebrates its 5 regional continental economic blocs. So obviously we are sitting within the SADC region, the Southern African Development Community. And then of course you have ECOWAS within Western Africa, you have CMAC within Central Africa, you have the Eastern African communities, etc. So most people are quite comfortable with the discussion about the 5 regional blocks across continental Africa, but fewer people are aware of the fact that indeed there is an economic bloc for the diaspora, which is what we call the economic community of the African diaspora 6th region. And effectively, what ECO6 is structured to do is facilitate an interface between the diaspora and the 5 regional blocks on the continent in a new era of African economic cooperation and development as articulated within the African Continental Free Trade Area, of course, and of course within the African Economic Community itself. So ECO6 brings together a body of governments, civil society, corporate entities from throughout the diasporic community in the Caribbean, in Central, South, and North America, in Europe, and in Asia as a harmonized body that is capable of engaging with the entire continent.
Of course, if I am getting you correctly, this organization's mandate is just to harness the collective power of the African diaspora, but maybe it will help a little bit to define what we mean by the term diaspora.
Well, indeed. I know that for many people on the continent, when you mention the diaspora, they most often think about those people who have recently left the continent to find new opportunities in Europe or in America, as it were. But there is another category to the diaspora, and indeed it is the largest constituency of the diaspora, and that is the historical diaspora, those people of African descent who were taken away during the transatlantic slave trade starting as early as the late 1400s and continuing right up until the mid-19th century. And consequently, we have over 300 million people who today regard themselves as being people of African descent who have found their origins outside of continental Africa as a consequence of that historical slave legacy. And so when we talk about the diaspora in that regard, we very much refer to the historical diaspora as well as those recent migrants from the continent.
Yeah, but now if we talking about it because of the constituency behind it, you know, how big is this constituency for it now to see itself as an influencer in the economic African space?
Indeed. You know, the discussion first and foremost of South-South trade is nothing new to the African family. For decades now, there's been discussions between leaders on the continent and leaders in the diaspora about how we can, for example, drive trade between the continent and major populaces such as Brazil, the continent, and major constituencies such as the Caribbean. Indeed, we recognize that given the economic commonalities and the ability that the opportunities that avail itself by interfacing with this bloc exceeds manifold the trade opportunities that we see with purely interfacing with Asia or America or Europe alone. And so South-South trade has always been a hot topic, and there's a lot of policies in place to advance it. And what Eco6 does is it adds the diaspora within Europe, for example, the diaspora in France, the diaspora in Britain, as well as the diaspora throughout Asia and Asia Minor, to that overall discussion on South-South trade. So we consolidate our numbers, we look at the economic opportunities, which is not in the billions, but in the trillions. And I'll come to that when I speak about the performance of our financial stimulus in 2021. So we have economic opportunities that are in the trillions, and ultimately we also have a knowledge base that complements the knowledge base on the continent as well, so that we're able to bring diversification to the solutions that are brought to the table for African economic transformation.
Yeah. And I'm happy you clarified the fact that when most often we talk about people in the diaspora, we talk about Africans who just left for greener pastures overseas, you know. But like I was saying earlier, if we are to have the confidence in Eco6 in terms of its constituency, how big is this constituency, for instance? And do these people see themselves as Africans, you know? Because, for instance, I know of people that are in America, although they are of African descent, you know, but they would like to see themselves as Americans. I don't know if they reflect on their background in terms of their ancestral lands and things like that, you know. Can we have confidence that they are part of this dream, this vision, you know, because like we are saying, they are African in the diaspora, but do they see themselves as that? Because some of them were born in America, their grandparents were born in America or Brazil or Europe, wherever, you know. Do they identify with the African continent?
Well, I would like to think that I'm a case in point of the very example that you've given. I was born and raised in Canada, and of course my parents come from the Caribbean. Notwithstanding, I feel very much in tune with my African identity, and indeed throughout Eco6 there is a movement today. Indeed, it's resonated throughout Hollywood, it resonates throughout our music industry. There is a movement amongst the diaspora, particularly those people who are of the historic diaspora, to become even more in tune with continental Africa. We see unique opportunities for driving business and trade. For example, if you look at fashion on the continent, the diaspora is in, we love African fashion. And there's a large demand for African fashion. So part of what Eco6 would do is facilitate those relations between the continent and the diaspora, where we can have access to our continental fashion designers. There's a movement within the musical sector for an exchange, because there's a large demand for African music within the diaspora. And of course, as we begin the process of industrialization, we look to see what kind of aesthetics can we get from our African eyes when we bring the diaspora and the continent together. It's one thing to look at the iPhone as a design, but how would the iPhone look if it were designed by Africans? You see, it's one thing to look at the automotive industry, but you know, the African Diaspora Bank has recently engaged with Mondrali in South Africa, and so we look at what do automobiles look like when designed with the vision of Africans. So the diaspora not only feels that it is part of the African cultural heritage and identity, but by creating Eco6, we are making an official commitment to being part of Africa's economic transformation at a global level.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find a way to help our viewers, our constituents appreciate the nature of this organization, especially by virtue of its by the nature of its constituency. Someone is going to say, is it possible to have an organization whose constituency is not within the African domain? You know, how it's going to have influence on African issues, because these are people that are living in America, these are people that are living in Brazil, and so on and so forth. You know, I need us to get the full context of how this is going to be useful and how it is already useful for Africa.
Well, indeed, you know, when we talk about the African domain, first and foremost, I would like to think that Africa sees itself as being a global agent. and consequently Africa's domain is the world. I know that historically we've become accustomed to talking about the first world and the third world, but indeed as Africa begins its economic renaissance, and as we push forth with this new African economic agenda, we must see the African domain as being the world. And consequently, when Africa looks, for example, to the United States, and we have our goods and services originating on the continent, and we look for a target market in America, it should be known that there are 53 million people of African descent within the United States who make a ready, willing, and available market with whom the continent can engage. The same is true for Brazil, where we have over 120 million people of African descent. The same is true for France, for Britain, for the Caribbean. So the African domain is a global domain and must recognize the presence of its historical diaspora in terms of strategic movements within this new era of industrialization and industrial development.
Of course. And when we talk about ECO6 as Africa's sixth region, it must speak to the already existing vision of Africa, for instance, in terms of African integration, if it's SADC in terms of regional integration, and ECOWAS in terms of that regional the regional integration of that bloc. How are you coming of African integration to an even larger extent of your Agenda 2063, which speaks broadly to some of the issues which you may represent as ECO6, what do you represent? What are your strategic objectives which are going to complement both the regional bloc's objectives and the broader African integration objective or goal?
Well, in fulfillment of the continental agenda, you have a broad sphere of continental out to the diaspora for engagement. So even in the Caribbean, we've recently had His Excellency President Nana Addo-Dankwa Akufo-Addo, the President of Ghana, coming to the Caribbean to court us in that economic development. We've had President Kenyatta from Kenya coming to court us in that development. And indeed, even just a few weeks ago, South Africa's president celebrated joint Christmas festivities with the Caribbean region. So there is a lot of movement at the leadership level, and that needs to be consolidated at the economic level. So what we bring forth as an economic community is a diverse body of expertise that are tier one in all classes, that is ready, willing, and able to engage with the continent in what would be an industrialization process. The diaspora doesn't come forth having all the answers. We come forth with our resources and we say we are available, we are here, let's work together and bring the continent and our ancestral lands to its right position on the international stage today.
Yeah, if like I was saying, African integration remains one of Africa's key priorities, towards the collective development of its people. And amongst some of its objectives is to make sure that we trade amongst ourselves as African. We stop exporting things we shouldn't be importing. And of course the issue of us using a single currency, which is also going to accelerate trade amongst ourselves, and the issue of road infrastructure amongst other things, And I know already that ECO6 has already set up a currency which is intended to help in that regard.
Well, first and foremost, and I say this as a financial engineer, we see the monetary solutions as being cornerstone to all processes of industrialization. So in order for the continent to achieve its developmental agendas, it must obviously have liquidity of capital, which is capable of driving that developmental agenda. And consequently, in creating our currency, which is the Lumi, we've created a currency that is perhaps unparalleled by any other currency in the world today. Most currencies on the international stage today are fiat instruments, which is to say they no longer adhere to a gold standard, with the exception of those countries in the Middle East, such as the United Arab Emirates, where they still associate their policy with petroleum energy. And what we've done is we've looked at what is perhaps the foremost international politic on the stage today, energy will be a necessary component for driving that economic development. Today, there are some 650 million people across the continent and within diaspora communities who do not have access to sustainable electricity. And so by having a currency that speaks to economic development and growth, as there's a direct correlation between energy and economic development, we put ourselves where we could take investment risks that other capital structures normally would not take. And that is simply because we have an appetite for energy within our currency itself, and consequently we have an appetite for financing sustainable development in all spheres of the economy. And that's what the Lumi allows us to do.
Yeah. Like I asked earlier, the issue of Africa moving forward also lies within how it handles the issue of trade amongst each other. And I think the issue of currency has been one of the major issues. Can we see the Lumi as that currency which Africa can adopt as a currency of intra-Africa trade?
You know, I would hazard to say that the Lumi and its users throughout the continent have already put itself directly in that situation, which is to say that last year we had 80 million transactions with the Lumi in 2021, which was our first year under the auspices of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the volume for those transactions were some 347 million Lumi, which is a parity value of about 1.1 trillion US dollars, which is to say that in 1 year, we have achieved almost 50% of Africa's GDP in relation to 2019. We've achieved almost 50% of that GDP. I believe it was about 2.6 trillion in 2019. And that has been achieved by African business, African retail, African consumer, African citizen demand.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Lumi in terms of its power in the exchange markets.
So when you say the exchange market, you're referring
the exchange rate, for instance, against the US dollar, against our local currency, against the rand, and how does it stand?
Yes, indeed. So because the Lumi is a not robust, so one Lumi has a parity value of 15.96 US dollars. And I believe within the local currency, the umlangani, one Lumi is 240 umlangani.
One Lumi, 240 emalangeni.
Yes.
You change one Lumi, you get 240 emalangeni.
That's correct.
You change one Lumi, you get about 15 US dollars.
16 if you're going to round it off. Yes.
16 US dollars.
Indeed.
Of course. Wow, that's fantastic. When we talk about the transactions that we experienced, you know, what do they mean in terms of the way you are projecting yourself to solve the African problem? This 80 million which we saw last year.
And yes. Well, the 80 million transactions come on the backdrop of our economic stimulus that ECO6 has issued as a consequence of COVID-19. We recognize that, of course, the international community has issued economic stimuluses to their populaces. Americans have enjoyed an economic stimulus. Canada has enjoyed an economic stimulus. Europe has enjoyed an economic stimulus, but there has not as yet been a robust economic stimulus throughout continental Africa. And so within our parliament, we had passed legislation authorizing a 3-year economic stimulus valued at 6.26 lumi per month. That's a parity value of $100 per month. And that is for people of African descent both on the continent and in the diaspora. And what's happened over the course of the last year in terms of the 80 million transactions is because we've been driving relations between the continent and the diaspora from a trade perspective, you've had retailers on the continent looking for consumers in the diaspora and vice versa. So those are real-time trade activities that have been occurring from people who see their local market opportunities as perhaps being otherwise limited. So we offer the diaspora as a secondary market while at the same time trying to buffer local economies.
Yeah, and I'm happy that we are having this discussion and you are in Eswatini. This is not a Zoom discussion and you are sitting in Jamaica or in the Caribbean or wherever it could be. You've had a couple of meetings with critical stakeholders as you've just come into the Kingdom of Eswatini, amongst which is the Central Bank of Eswatini, and it's quite critical that we speak about the presence or the engagement with the central bank, because we've had a lot of issues with scams, if I may say,
Indeed, yes.
where people, for instance, now we are talking about cryptocurrencies and the likes, and people are asking the questions, and we know there's a lot of forex trading taking place, and I am not in any way trying to associate the Lumi with those kind of scandals or scams or whatever it could be. What is the central bank saying in terms of how you have approached them and your intentions for the Eswatini market, and how you want the Lumi to be perceived, to be regulated by the central bank?
Well, indeed, the Central Bank of Eswatini has been very receptive. Since I've come, we've had quite a few meetings with them, and I know I have another engagement with them next week. I wouldn't want to go into too much details as it pertains to those discussions, but...
You have had an engagement with them, though.
Oh, of course. I mean,
yeah.
and as I've said, they've been very receptive and quite welcoming. What is important to keep in mind, and I think to differentiate from the earlier examples you gave, a lot of people speak about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. The Lumi is not a cryptocurrency, and the African Diaspora Central Bank is not a conventional commercial bank. So first and foremost, it's important to understand that the African Diaspora Central Bank itself is a regional financial institution and monetary authority in the exact same way that the European Central Bank functions as a regional monetary authority. And consequently, our currency, which is not a cryptocurrency, but rather is a regional currency. And so in our discussions with the central bank, the focal point is on regional integration as articulated under the 1991 Abuja Treaty, and also obviously as called for within the African Continental Free Trade Area. And of course, looking at how we can immediately integrate Lumi within the Eswatini economy so that the citizens of Eswatini can use the monthly stimulus within all of the merchants, within all places of businesses, paying their local rents, etc., and how the diaspora can drive trade and investment relations between Eswatini and ECO 6 member states itself.
Of course. And if we talk about the Lumi becoming part of the Eswatini's ecosystem, it also speaks to issues of how it can contribute to the revenue base of the Kingdom of Eswatini. And I know with digital currencies, there's a conversation globally as to whether or not digital currencies are taxable. Can they contribute to the tax system of a country? Is this a case with the Lumi, for instance?
Well, one of the immediate benefits when we speak about revenues for the state, the Lumi is issued on the SWIFT payments platform. And what our payments platform allows is for the immediate collection of taxation at the time of transaction and having that delivered to state coffers. And so what it means is that for the first time, rather than having government wait for businesses to fill in their tax returns and declare what their revenues or rather sales have been over any quarter or period, at the time of transaction, because all things are within our payments platform and analoged within that blockchain-like structure, although it's not fully blockchain, the government receives their taxes in real time. And that will be a great benefit not only for Eswatini, but for all African states and kingdoms, as collecting revenue has always been a problem for the state. In fact, it's been the biggest problem for the state. And we believe that our currency almost single-handedly addresses that issue by creating a scenario in which the state suddenly finds itself having regular revenue flows, which it hasn't had before in the past, and consequently being able to balance its books and operate in a fundamentally different way.
Yeah. And how are you, I know you are also one of the economic or regional blocks, as we are calling it, Africa's sixth regional bloc. There is no way I see you imposing your objectives or your agenda on the other economic or regional blocks like your SADC and the likes, you know. But how are you selling your narrative, if I may use that terminology? How are you projecting yourself to the African Union, for instance, that has goals and a desire for African regional integration, and amongst which was to introduce a currency, you know. And I think one of these economic blocks, which is ECO6, a new child in the game, you know, has done what no other, if they may, maybe not at this scale, you know. How are they appreciating it so that maybe we look at this as an African thing, you know, as opposed to what ECO6 is doing, you know. I know that you also have engagement with the African Union, for instance, at a particular level, and the other regional blocks, you know. How is their reception in terms of saying we can use this, we can speak to our members in terms of the absorption of the Lumi into...
Well, I think first and foremost there's two hats that need to be regarded here. There's the hat of the African Union as the African Union itself, and of course there's the hat of the African economic community within the African Union. And consequently, because we are an economic community, our focal point thus far has been, of course, we were invited and created under the auspices of the AU initially, but our focal point thus far has been inter-regional integration, recognizing that economic communities across the continent are the foundations for the African Continental Free Trade Area. And in terms of the reception by the AU and by the other member states, I mean, obviously last year we successfully established a legal presence in all of the economic communities. So it's been a journey, but it's been a wonderful journey, I must concede. And at the same time, because the diaspora is outside of the continent, we are coming very much to terms with, on the one hand, the aspirations of continental leaders, and on the other hand, the legacy of colonialism, which sometimes stands in the way of those aspirations. Now, our framework and policy is ultimately to work with our continental brothers and adhere to the legislation that's being put in place. And so we've taken a compliance approach, if you will, towards integration. And by taking a compliance approach, we recognize that within Chapter 6 of the Abuja Treaty, it speaks to the need for the African Central Bank to have a presence. It speaks to the need to have a single continental currency. And so we've engaged the African Financial Regulatory Authority, whom we've signed a bilateral trade agreement with, to ensure that as it relates to compliance, ECO6 is regulatorily speaking in line with all of the aspirations of the continent.
If I may just chip in quickly, the Abuja Treaty you are talking about was signed, was it how many years ago?
In 1991, that's
in
correct.
1991, that's about 31 years ago.
Correct.
You know, and I think most of its aspirations have not been fulfilled till today, including the single African currency. You know, what do you think has been the challenge in that regard, and how do you see ECO6 stepping in maybe to try and influence things to take the right direction. And of course, I think the Lumi has already been introduced. Do you see the continent, appreciating, and stepping up to say, I think this is what we have been waiting for. And I don't know what the challenges have been. Do you think the Lumi will withstand those challenges? Because like I'm saying, it's been 31 years, but some of its aspirations have still not been fulfilled till today.
Indeed. The Abuja Treaty, you're absolutely correct. It's been 31 years since its ratification. And within the treaty itself, it has a 34-year horizon. So there's still 3 more years within the overall mandate of the Abuja Treaty. And we should look at the African Continental Free Trade Area as being kind of an amalgamation of all the nuances within the Abuja Treaty. I wouldn't want to go into too much of a discussion about why those targets
Have not been met.
Have not been achieved, because I think there are too many nuances. But what I will say to that point is that literacy, and when I say literacy, I mean financial literacy, legal literacy, and legislative literacy plays an important role in a nation, in a region, and in a continent being able to achieve its goals and objectives. And so consequently, on the one hand, we have a policy that says that there's supposed to be one continental currency. And yet none of the central banks across the continent have prepared themselves to receive a single continental currency or integrate it. We have a policy that says that there should be free transport or free mobility of persons across the continent, meaning you should be able to sit in the kingdom of Eswatini and go to Egypt without perhaps confronting any borders. But that's not the case. And what that means is that legislative literacy is not where it needs to be. Our policy creators are not ensuring that the legislation at a regional and continental level are being adhered to. And so for the diaspora, by having a focus on compliance, irrespective of what the causes are, and some people would say the causes are external, we would take the compliance approach to ensure that, number one, we do have a currency, which is already being integrated in 190 countries across the world. There's not a country in Africa, by the way, where somebody is not using Lumi. So it is already both de facto and de jure a continental currency. And we will agitate and push for Lumi not only being the continent's currency, but Africa's global currency, so that the world understands that in this 21st century, Africa has come for a new era of economic development, a new era of industrialization based upon areas of interest for the global African family, and not simply following the by other third parties.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to elaborate, but because of time, I will stop you from there. The issue of literacy. Some countries, for instance, Eswatini, will tell you that our literacy rate is about 78%. Country. But I think we will have this discussion later on, maybe when we pursue this interview. There's the issue of the stimulus package, which you mentioned earlier, and I want Doris to help us to appreciate that, the stimulus package, Doris, America, and I think I when I first saw it, was it in 2020? It was in Hong Kong when the government gave $10,000 to every person that's above the age of 18. $150,000 every person over the age of 18 received the $10,000. When we are talking about the stimulus package as part of what Eco6 is doing, and people of the Kingdom of Eswatini are supposed to be benefiting from, what is happening? What is the criteria? Who is eligible to benefit from the stimulus? How much is a person getting? At what process, and what are the processes really involved?
Okay, ngiyabonga sheme lithuba. Lengingakusho kwanyalo, ngingasho ukuthi yimvo vele besolo siyilangatele lasimaswati siyibona
Kulamanye amave.
lamanye amave noma khona labo mabona kuthi kepha ngiyajabula ke namhlanje sigcine kutifeke ngetinyawo tako lakithi bengacabangi lokuthi khona umflo ngachamuka angiphe nje imali because ngathi mina kimi dasasa ngathi batawusipha imali simaswati lo munye kwangitshela wathi lemvo is unbelievable ukuthi umflo ngachamuka nje afika kuphi imali kude lokufakako ngathi kude lokufakako it's just your ID card lokhu nje uliswati bese songena Google page so ya download le app so ayithola imali yakho that is 1.5 but mayichamuka le ibang lo $100 but mase ze-converted to swazi currency ebang 1.5 ngi-testimony ke kule nto leyo mina ingenile nje mhla ka-28 because bathi babafika lo mhla ka-13 December sayicala i-register full people were flocking by understand futhi okay bekunebantu labadzala kakhulu because siyasathi isimo sethu semnotho eveni bebafika babute ngineke ngibhalisa njani mfana nami ngoba nyalo labantu vale sesibadele but bahlakaniphe kakhulu bayakhona sebenza labo online mawufika nje ekhaya ukutshela umfana sengichafatele la uyachafada umfana uyakuregister ufike egcina uyayithola imali yakho le 1.5 icala eminyakeni lona 13 years umfana usenza certificate ke loyo uregister up until esaluka tini lesithonzotelako shokuthi wonke umfumele a benefit uyasebenza awusebenzi yingci nje mawuliswati une certificate une ID uyayithola le mali.
Yeah.
Yes.
These are interesting developments, honestly. And what is the intention of this stimulus package? Like Doris is saying, she was basically saying it is unbelievable that someone would come from a land afar and say, if you register here, I'm going to give you $100, which is an equivalent of 1,500 in my language. What is the intention, honestly? I need you to say it so that Eswatini can follow it up and then pursue it. And like I'm asking, what is the intention? How is this meant to benefit the people of Eswatini and the country at large, really?
Well, the intention goes back to what we've been discussing all along. It is African economic transformation. And as it pertains to Eswatini, it should be known to you that the diaspora has a great deal of love and regard for the kingdom. And one of our frameworks is recognizing that the traditions that the kingdom of Eswatini offers creates a sound framework for the diaspora to establish itself in an African space that has a solid culture, a solid identity, and speaks to what the diaspora is looking for in Africa on the one hand, while on the other hand recognizing there's the desire for industrialization. And so consequently, we put our currency on the table in Eswatini, in SADC, and across continental Africa as our contribution from the diaspora. You know, the question when you have a relation or a partnership, everybody puts on the table what they could bring to that partnership. And so the first thing the diaspora puts on the table is its currency. And we say, we are here to invest. We are here to invest in Eswatini. We are here to invest in the SADC region. And we are here to invest in continental Africa. That as a consequence of the COVID-19 economic collapse, not only do our people require investment, but they also require some immediate economic support. Intervention. There are some serious sufferings going on at this very moment, and we can't simply turn a blind eye to it. And so we see in the immediate present, and we anticipate that the COVID situation will last for another 24 to 36 months perhaps, that there needs to be an intervention. And so the Lumi comes forth as a non-apologetic economic intervention that acts as a buffer to bring some degree of stability to the people of Eswatini and to the global African family.
My President, thank you so much for taking your time to come through. I know we have not exhausted all the issues, and I know there's quite a lot that we still need to discuss. In particular, your intentions to set up the SADC head office in Eswatini. Sorry, the Eco6 SADC office in Eswatini, and which is what you are basically working on at the moment.
Indeed, the headquarters for the SADC region will be based here within the Kingdom of Eswatini. We have already established our presence, and we've already been invited and welcomed by His Majesty, and so consequently we're very thankful for having the Kingdom of Eswatini agree to host the diaspora as we now engage the entire SADC region.
Thank you so much once again, my President. Doris, thank you so much, my
Thank you,
sister.
Kanye.
I am hoping that if you are still around in Eswatini, I am going to invite you once more, probably with more stakeholders coming on board, like, for instance, your Eswatini regulator, the Eswatini Financial Regulatory Authority, the Central Bank, the Business Eswatini community. We need to explore the opportunities within the Africa Inter-Trade spectrum. And I'm sure if obviously alongside with the people who know what Eswatini is signed up to in terms of these international agreements. Thank you so much for coming through once again.
Thank you for having us here. It's been a pleasure.
Of course, maswatla mahle sibonga kakhulu ke kuba nathi ke ehlelweni la besikhuluma ke indaba te economic block lensha ke le sukunyisiwe leyadinga ukuthi ke Africa sikhulumisa ke indzaba lana ye-stimulus package. Ngethemba ukuthi ke Maswati atakhona kuyilandzelela leyo ndzaba a benefit. Like I am saying, we are going to follow up just to ensure that this is not just something that we have verbalized. We want to see Maswati say we have received the stimulus, and these are the testimonials around it, and I am definitely going to be following up on that. And if my president is still here, we are going to be bringing him again next week on the program. Jehovah Stina, sibonane ngalo kudakusiphilile. Nsale kahle.